The wind howled like a wounded spirit across the frozen wilderness of Siberia. Snow lashed against the small wooden cabin, piling high against its weather-beaten walls. The temperature had fallen to 71 baraks, a cold so brutal it could freeze breath in midair. Inside the cabin, an 80-year-old woman named Elena Ivanovna sat beside her iron stove, feeding it small pieces of firewood she had carefully rationed for the winter. She had lived alone in this remote stretch of Siberia for nearly 4 decades, ever since her husband passed away. The forest was harsh, but it had become her only companion. That evening, as the storm intensified, Elena heard something unusual. At first, she thought it was just another gust of wind rattling her door. But then it came again. 3 heavy thuds against the wooden frame, slow, deliberate, not the wind. Her heart pounded. Wolves sometimes wandered close during storms, sometimes even desperate hunters from distant settlements. Gathering her courage, she wrapped a thick woolen shawl around her shoulders and approached the door. The knocking came again, softer this time, almost pleading. Elena slowly unlatched the door. The sight before her stole the air from her lungs. Standing in the blizzard, snow clinging to her thick brown fur, was a massive wild bear. Her dark eyes were not wild with rage, but filled with something else: desperation, fear, act. The bear's feet lay a tiny cub, barely moving, its small body trembling against the icy ground. For a long moment, woman and beast stared at each other. Elena should have shut the door. Any sane person would have, but she had spent her life reading the forest. She knew when danger stood before her, and this was not that. The mother bear did not growl. She did not bare her teeth. Instead, she nudged the cub gently toward the doorway. The cub whimpered weakly. Elena whispered, "Oh, you poor thing." The bear took one slow step back as if giving permission. The old woman's hands trembled, but not from fear. Carefully, she bent down and lifted the cub. It was lighter than she expected, its fur cold and damp, its breathing shallow. The little creature was burning with fever despite the freezing air. When Elena looked up again, the mother bear remained still, watching closely. "I will help," Elena said softly, unsure why she spoke aloud. Perhaps it was to calm herself. Perhaps it was to reassure the bear. Slowly, she carried the cub inside her cabin. For a second, she feared the bear would follow, but instead the great animal lay down just outside the door, curling her massive body against the storm, her eyes never leaving the cabin. Elena shut the door gently, her heart racing. Inside, she placed the cub near the stove and wrapped it in old blankets. She heated water, crushed dried herbs she had gathered in summer, and began rubbing the cub's tiny paws to restore circulation. The storm did not weaken through the night. Snow buried the steps of the cabin, and the wind screamed like a living thing outside the wooden walls. Yet inside, a strange warmth filled the small room, one not only from the iron stove, but from the fragile life fighting to survive beside it. Elena worked through the night without rest. The cub's breathing was uneven, shallow, and shaky. Its tiny body shivered uncontrollably despite the blankets. She dipped a cloth into warm herbal water and gently wiped its nose and eyes. The fever was high, too high. She had seen animals die from less in these frozen lands. "You must be strong," she whispered softly, stroking the cub's head. "Your mother is waiting." At the sound of her voice, the cub gave a faint whimper. It tried to move but lacked the strength. Elena mixed a thin broth from goat milk powder she had saved and carefully fed the cub using a wooden spoon. At first, nothing happened. Then slowly, weakly, the cub swallowed. A flicker of hope stirred inside her. Every few minutes, Elena glanced toward the frosted window. The massive shadow of the mother bear was still there. She had not moved far. Occasionally, the bear would rise, walk in a slow circle through the snow, then return to the same spot near the door. It was as if she understood that her cub was inside, and that she must wait. Hours passed. Near dawn, the cub's breathing steadied slightly. The trembling lessened. Elena adjusted the blankets and placed one of her wool scarves around its small body for extra warmth. She could feel the fever beginning to lower, just a little. Exhausted, she finally sat back in her wooden chair. Memories surfaced in her mind. Years ago, when her own son had fallen ill during a harsh winter, she had sat exactly like this, praying, waiting, fighting against time and cold. But she had lost him to sickness long before help could reach them. Tears filled her eyes now. "Not this one," she whispered. "Not again." Suddenly, there was movement at the door. A low rumbling sound vibrated through the wood. Not aggressive, not threatening, almost like a question. Elena stood slowly and approached the door. She hesitated for only a second before opening it slightly. The mother bear was closer now, snow covering her thick fur. Her eyes locked onto Elena's face. There was no roar, no growl, just silent concern. "She's alive," Elena said gently, though she knew the bear could not understand her words. Yet somehow she felt understood. The bear leaned forward slightly, sniffing the air that escaped from the warm cabin. A soft sound came from her throat, almost like a sigh of relief. Elena closed the door again to keep the heat inside. By midday, the storm finally began to weaken. Pale sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting a faint silver glow across the endless white forest. Inside, the cub stirred more strongly. It opened its tiny eyes for the first time and let out a small but clear cry. Elena's heart leaped. By late afternoon, the storm had almost completely passed. The sky above Siberia turned pale blue, and sunlight reflected off the endless snow like shattered glass. Inside the cabin, the cub was no longer trembling. Its breathing had grown stronger, steadier. When Elena gently touched its head, it responded with a soft, curious sound instead of a weak whimper. "You are a fighter," she whispered with a tired smile. The cub struggled to sit up. Its tiny paws pressed clumsily against the wooden floor, and after 2 failed attempts, it managed to lift itself halfway. Elena supported it gently, careful not to frighten it. The fever had broken. Its eyes were clearer now, bright, dark, and alert. Outside, a deep rumbling sound echoed again near the door. The mother bear. Elena knew it was time. Her heart felt unexpectedly heavy. In just one night, this small wild creature had awakened something inside her, an old ache she had carried for years. Caring for the cub had brought back memories of holding her own child, of protecting something fragile against a cruel world. But the forest has its laws. Wild things belong to the wild. She wrapped the cub loosely in one blanket and slowly opened the door. Cold air rushed inside, sharp and biting. The mother bear stood only a few steps away. Her massive body cast a long shadow across the snow. The moment the door opened wider, the cub made a sudden, excited sound. The bear froze. Elena carefully stepped aside and lowered the cub onto the snow just outside the doorway. For one terrifying second, she wondered if the cold would be too much. But the cub, now stronger, wobbled forward on unsteady legs. The mother bear approached slowly, every movement deliberate, cautious. Her eyes never left her cub. When she reached it, she lowered her enormous head and gently touched it with her nose. The cub responded with a small cry and pressed against her thick fur. The relief in the mother bear's posture was unmistakable. She circled the cub once, sniffing, checking, confirming that it was alive and safe. Then she looked up at Elena. The old woman stood silently in the doorway. For a long moment, time seemed to stop. The forest was completely quiet. No wind, no distant howls. Just the 3 of them standing in the frozen world. The bear's dark eyes met Elena's. There was no fear there now. No desperation. Only something that felt very close to gratitude. The massive animal slowly lowered her head, not in threat, not in submission, but in something that felt like acknowledgement. A silent understanding had passed between human and wild. Then, with gentle strength, the mother bear nudged her cub forward. The cub stumbled but quickly found balance beside her. Step by step, they began walking back toward the trees. Elena watched until their shapes blended into the forest. The snow carried their tracks for a long distance before the wind slowly began to erase them. She stood at her doorway long after they were gone.